It's very sad, that situation.
Yeah.
It's terrible. And there are many stories like that,
Yes, it's not alone.
yeah, but you happen to be personally involved with that event.
Yeah, I mean, it was very similar to the Sophie Broussard story, which is really how I got involved. Like, I had been scientifically interested in AIDS for some years, but it wasn't until I got involved with trying to help Sophie Broussard, who was an HIV positive woman in Montreal, that I really realized that, that this was a psychological battle, that this was a battle over belief systems. And again, the system managed to destroy Sophie Broussard, leaving her two sons in the charge of her father, who was willing to go along with whatever the doctors said, or at least he was overtly compliant. I don't know if the whole battle had convinced him that the drugs were deadly, and maybe he weaned his children off the drugs. I don't know. He would never talk to me after Sophie died. But they basically harassed her until I think she died like a hunted animal, because she just couldn't deal with the stress of the situation. She was one of those very, very dynamic women, very emotional about a lot of different things. And it was very difficult for her to sort of sit down and say, okay, I'm in danger of losing my children. This is what I must do. When she was angry, she would just tell people she was angry. She could not say, okay, I'm very, very angry, but what I have to do is to pretend that I'm happy. And I have to walk in and lie to these people who are trying to take my children and keep them happy. And the satisfaction has to be that I'm going to keep my children. And she was unable to do that. It's unfortunate. It's in these situations, certain personalities manage to be able to deal with the situation calmly, and they understand that they have to tell these powerful people, doctors are very powerful and they need to be told what they want to hear. And some people can manage to do that. And it's unfortunate when they're unable to.
So, David, how would you see yourself in this? I guess it's a fight. What is your role? Are you like a communicator?
Well, one of the things I've really tried to do is to bring the science closer to people, and people who've been on my website know that, like, if you look up the issue of say AZT, you can go and you can get scientific quotes on any particular issue, like liver disease or anemia, or you can find out information on various aspects of HIV transmission. So that's one of the things I've tried to do, is to bring the science to the people. If I can put a quote in front of you from a scientific paper, and you read that quote and you go, holy cow, that is just amazing.
And you do this with your podcast, How Positive Are You, don't you?
Yeah, as well, we try to use that. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do. I guess that's probably my main thing. I'm trying to say, look, the science is not beyond your comprehension. I can make it a little easier for you. You don't have to read 1,000 papers on AIDS, because I've already done that. But if you think I'm trying to pull the wool over your eyes, then you can go to the library, you can get that paper out, and you can see that exact quote. And I think if people who are skeptical do it 3 or 4 times, they'll realize that when I put a quote on the website or in an article that I write, or if I read it on the podcast, that this is the absolute truth. That is what's written. I know that I can't lie about anything, because that would destroy my reputation, so I don't. And I think once people realize that, they can go to these annotated bibliographies, which is probably the best way to describe them, and they can get the ammunition that they need. If somebody says, oh, AIDS drugs don't harm the liver, well, they can go and get 100 citations that show the opposite. And I think that's how people have to fight back, and these are the weapons that people need to fight back. how people deal with their subconscious is something I'm not an expert in, and people like Michael Elner, who's a hypnotherapist, or others who sort of work with people's psychology, are much more needed in that circumstance.
Yeah. Well, even though you're giving the facts to people, and I've seen some pretty ridiculous and idiotic comments on the net, you still seem to attract your share of complete mental cases, I think. People writing letters to say you don't exist.
Oh, Mr. Seth Kalikman, yes.
I mean, what kind of a retarded consciousness could come out with that after reading some of the articles or listening to some of the podcasts that you produce? I have to wonder if it's just a joke.
Well, here's an interesting thing about Seth Kalikman. He is a psychiatry professor, I believe, at the University of Connecticut.
He's what?
He just wrote a psychiatry professor.
You're joking, aren't you?
No, I'm serious.
Oh.
At the University of Connecticut, and he's just written a book on AIDS, what he calls AIDS denialism. But here's the really interesting thing. For some time, for maybe the last couple of years, I would occasionally receive emails from a man who called himself Joseph Newton, and I was always a bit puzzled by this man. Well, I shouldn't say man, because he kind of acted like a bit of a boy. He seemed very juvenile, and he was what you might call a real suck-up. Like he'd always be saying things like, "Oh, so and so is so wonderful, and this incredible battle you're in. When are you going to win it?" It just seemed like he was trying to suck up to me for some reason, which I didn't understand, because people don't have to do that. I kind of prefer adult conversations. And sometimes he was a bit inconsistent in what he said, but I would answer his questions, and I didn't confide in him, not because I didn't trust him, but because I just didn't really see him as having any of his own viewpoints. He would always put somebody else's viewpoint in front of me and say, "What do you think about this?" And I've had this a number of times where people will engage in lengthy correspondence with me, and I start to say, "Look, you can figure this out for yourself. You have to think it through for yourself. You cannot come to me or to anybody else and say, 'What do you think?' Because if you're not thinking, then you're never going to solve this puzzle." So anyway, this went on for some time, but for some reason, I can't quite remember why, we started to get a little bit suspicious of this man. And I say we because Dr. Henry Bauer and a few others were also getting emails from Joseph Newton. And at some point, we realized that we didn't really know anything about him. He said he was a public health student from Connecticut. That's all we knew. Well, somebody did a little bit of research and discovered that his email address was originating, or many of the emails were originating from the University of Connecticut. So I asked Joseph Newton, I said, "Will you please provide some proof of your existence, of your identity?" And so because I asked Joseph Newton for his existence, and we now know that Joseph Newton is Seth Kalikman. So Seth Kalikman turned around and tried to be clever, because I had argued that maybe HIV didn't exist. So on bulletin boards, he was saying maybe David Crowe doesn't exist.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to get that background. It
goes
explains
even,
it a bit. Go on.
It gets even better than that. Because last year, Peter Duesberg and others organized a conference on cancer, Peter Duesberg's theory on aneuploidy on cancer, and Joseph Newton registered for that conference, and we have his registration form. And that registration form has the phone number, fax number, and address of Seth Kalikman. And when Seth Kalikman showed up at the conference, he wore a badge saying Joseph Newton. So he went to a conference under a false name. Now, why would he do this? There's something weird going on that I don't understand, because he could have gone to that conference saying, "Peter, I'm a big skeptic of your theories on HIV and AIDS, and I'm actually writing a book on how dangerous your theories are," and Peter would have still let him go to the conference. So it was all totally unnecessary.
Yeah, very interesting.
But, it helps him because he can believe that the only way that he could get within the mindset of the dissidents was through false pretenses, because after all, we don't like talking to other people. But the shoe, I'm afraid, is on the other foot.
Definitely is.
It's always been